Good day, everyone. How is everyone? Right, okay, so today it is the. Yes, I'm not with it quite yet. Today it is the 26th of Ærra. It is, and that makes it the 19th of December. Yes, it does. And being it's a morning day, it's time for Politics Live. Yes, it's gonna be going out on Tuesday, but fuck it. Format once again. It's you guys can hear it. I haven't got the software set up at the moment for me to record it. But it's the volume set up loud enough so you guys can hear it. I'll pause it for my responses and my reactions to it. So there's your format. Yes, it's likely to I'm hoping it'll change in the next year or two, but we'll see how it goes. This is coming from the channel Political TV. Usually get this from. And here we go.
Joining me today, Conservative MP Laura Farris, Labour MP Rushanara Ali, Times Radio political correspondent Charlotte Ivers, and Spiked columnist Ella Whelan. Today,
I'm keen to continue a dialogue with the trade unions because there's a range of issues that matter to staff.
We are prepared to talk to you, but they will not talk to us about the elephant in the room, which is pay.
No sign of a breakthrough as nurses, paramedics, border force staff and civil servants prepare to strike.
This is just the first court to hear this case, and we believe, and our lawyers have told us, that we probably do have grounds to carry on fighting.
The High Court rules the government does have the legal power to send asylum seekers to Rwanda.
But there are
walking down a really busy street with my headphones in when a guy told me that I was sexy, making comments about me, about my body.
Will a new law put a stop to sexual harassment on the streets? And why an e-scooter might not be an ideal Christmas gift.
I used to have e-scooters.
Well, let's start with strikes. Let's just show you this calendar of who is striking when. You get there the flavour of what is going to happen as the week unfolds. Nurses tomorrow, ambulance drivers on Wednesday, and various transport workers and Border Force and Royal Mail across.
So, Thursday is nurses in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Wednesday is ambulances in England and Wales. From Thursday is till Sunday is highway workers. For Friday to Sunday is Border Force, Royal Mail. Lagardère is rail buses till over the weekend is rail and buses, but from today until Lagardère, from today until Saturday is driving examiners. We've got the biggest.
The rest of the week. You heard the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, and union leader there in the headlines. There's no resolution thus far. The government isn't budging. So my opening question to the panel is, starting with you, Laura, can the government hold the line on pay?
Well, I always sort of hate seeing industrial relations when they're reduced to the point where there's a kind of hostility that's developed between the union and the government. I mean, this is quite common.
The government was the one who got on fucking
I hope that there is a way through on this. I think that it is important, just particularly in the health service, to look back at what the pay review body has said, because the reason it was set up was to take the politics out of it, that it would balance everything from recruitment and retention and affordability and motivational type issues and come up with an independent recommendation that would...
But government sets its remit. It sets the limit. It sets the scale, and how large or small the scale is on where they can plot the pay, where they can plot how much can be paid. So even then, it's a bit of a fallacy for them to say it's independent. Not only that, but the independent panel has been ignored before. The government's choosing not to.
Would be out of the hands of any particular politician. And it did come up with a recommendation for nurses.
Quite a long time ago, and ahead of soaring inflation.
And it did concede that it wouldn't match inflation. I do accept that there may be some movement, but I think it is right to say that the government did accept it in full. And so...
should they continue to do that?
Well, I think it's right that that is the starting point rather than the request that the RCN has made, which is, I mean, you know, it is a very high request of 19% if you take RPA.
But 4.75%.
Yep, they're a long way
5%
apart.
and 19%. Your colleagues like Caroline Noakes have said the government needs to make an improved offer.
Well, look, all I can say is this, because I'm just a backbench MP and I'm not part of this negotiation, but I think the biting effect of inflation is impacting everybody. The pay offer that's been made so far is worth 9% to the lowest paid nurses, and I think that that the government would say that they have to consider carefully the overall NHS budget, because increasing nurses' pay or any particular category of NHS.
But where's your gut?
So I think that the reality is that these things never resolve without further negotiation.
She did the whole... So she was really, really reaching.
I think the government is right to hold the line on where they've got to, but I think that, I think some of the hostility you're seeing, particularly in the last 24 hours, is a result of perhaps a lack of dialogue, and that is the starting point.
It's difficult, isn't it? Just listening to Laura sitting there, difficult to find a balance between saying the government must move, as 5 Conservative MPs have said, a small number, admittedly, and whether the government can hold the line.
I think it is, and I'd be quite reluctant of making predictions of where we are this time next month. What we do know is that the public do seem to support, particularly nurses striking, more than strikes as a general concept. They seem to have public support behind them in a way that is almost out of kilter with opinion polling on every other front. And so I think the Nurses Union do find themselves in a particularly strong position. And as a result of that, I wonder whether if the government does move on any front, it will be this one specifically.
And will they be able to differentiate and distinguish in terms of other workers like the railway workers, for example?
But that is the problem, isn't it? Because the minute that you concede on one front, everyone else will be saying, well, hang on, you managed to find the magic money tree with the nurses. How about us? Clearly, when you say there is no money, actually, there is some flexibility. So the government are in a really tricky position here, because if they move one part of the chessboard, suddenly everything else collapses around it.
Where are you, Ella?
I don't think it's difficult at all. I mean, what the demands that nurses are making, 19% pay rise is, equivalent to about £10 billion. That's 6.5% of the NHS budget. That, to me, that strikes as a bargain to make sure that the people that keep us alive are economically sound and...
Fucking boom. I don't usually agree with Emma Whelan. She usually pisses me off. I don't know. She seems to have some right-wing ideas that are just... Yeah. But she's bang on here. It's not a case of how much is too much. It's not. No. That's not the question we need to be asking. It's how much is enough. And right now, it is not enough.
And content in their jobs. You can't. There's this kind of cognitive dissonance that the government's working with, in which you've been, spent 2 years asking people to clap for nurses and all the rest of it, and then now won't cough up with the, let's face it, still relatively meagre. This isn't like flying to Barbados kind of wages. demands that nurses are making, find it within the budget, make some, we're always talking about how much wastage there is in the NHS, cut cleverly somewhere else and pay the people who really matter. But I think, it's an interesting point about the difference between nurses and rail workers. I mean, on the issue of strikes, I think what the nurses and healthcare workers who are taking industrial action have to be careful of is playing this game of sort of emotionalism, because of course when a nurse goes on strike, there's a greater possibility of death than when a rail worker goes on strike. Everybody knows that because of the nature of the work. But at the end of the day, they are both wage labourers. They are both people who are working and who need to take industrial action to make sure their conditions or their pay is satisfactory. And so they shouldn't be, this kind of emotional blackmail has kept nurses from being able to, and healthcare workers from being able to take strike action for far too long. So that's I wouldn't make a distinction between the two. They're all workers.
I'll come to you in just a moment, Roshanara. Your response to what Ella's just said?
Well, I think that, just coming back actually to what Charlotte said about the fact that I think that the public have...
No, she said what Emma just said.
...got higher support for the nurses' strike than other categories of worker, and I've seen that statistic too. And I think one of the things that can be quite dangerous is that you sort of get into this moral value type exercise with workers where people recognise the work of nurses, it's visible, and you can end up in a situation where a sort of emotional argument says, well, these people, have a very valuable job and somebody doing a boring job behind the scenes isn't worth as much. And in fact, I think you have to be a bit more dispassionate with paid negotiations. I do take your point, Ella, about pay and affordability and about paying people the right wages. But as well as everybody on the panel does, that current inflation rates are at the highest level.
Then why is it that the shareholders and shit of big companies get massive bump ups? Why is it that the people on the top get bump ups? The railways get subsidies whilst the railway workers are going out on strike. The profits are still coming in. Cut profits.
I think all of our lifetimes, and that has created problems in the private and in the public sector.
I think it's the government can't have just gone through what it went through in the last few years. The magic money tree was found 1 million times over throughout the pandemic, and I don't think anyone's going to criticise the government for doing that. But that whole argument of coffers are empty thing doesn't really work anymore, because you make political decisions. It's within a government's realms of possibility to make political decisions to make it happen. You can't keep relying on this. There is no alternative argument.
Well, I don't think that's... the government have accepted that nurses should get a pay rise, and they've made an offer already of 5%. Right. But the point is,
it's not
really
enough.
I'm going to bring in Roshanara, because the Labour front bench have rejected 19%, which is the demand from the Royal College of Nursing, RPI in level of inflation plus 5%. Do you think the government can hold the line and should hold the line?
I don't think the government should be holding a line not to negotiate with public sector workers.
I was asking specifically on pay.
On pay, they need to negotiate, because it's not just in the nursing sector.
They'll keep pointing, Labour also saying no to the 90. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that Labour wouldn't compromise. Yeah? Negotiate. But what you've got here is a press that wants to talk down about this, to think as if this side of it is immaterial. It might be to them.
And they haven't been on strike for over 100 years. It is railway workers. It's across the board in the legal justice system. This government has basically caused a shutdown of our economy, destroyed our economy, our public services, and nothing works. And people are fed up with it. So the government needs to get back on the negotiating table and discuss pay as well as conditions and get the country moving again. That's what's not happening. Now, in the time that we were in power, we didn't have this sort of industrial action because negotiations happened.
And you would like to see the Labour front bench perhaps suggest something closer to inflation?
Compromises were made, but the negotiations need to be made by the government.
Well, have a look at this on the front page of the Daily Mail. Outrage, it says the headline, at Gary Neville's World Cup rant over UK strikes. This is the football pundit Gary Neville comparing the conditions for striking nurses and railway staff here to those faced by migrant workers in Qatar, of which there's been much debate. Roshanara, was he right to make that comparison?
Well, I don't think it's comparable. These are very different societies and countries. and he's made his viewpoint as he has. But I think what's really
because he is a Labour Party member.
What's really important is that the UK does what it can to ensure there are decent international labour standards. The International Labour Organisation is an organisation that the Conservative Party, when they came into power, cut the funding for. That actually saves lives. So I think what's important is that we play our part. But these are two separate arguments. But of course, we need to be mindful of protecting people's rights and labour standards in our own country.
Yeah, I'll agree that it's two separate arguments here, but at the same time, they aren't completely unrelated. You know, it's a case of we want to make sure we don't start sliding down that route.
So should he have said it then? You say they're different. Should he have said it at all?
I think that that's a matter for him. What I'm concerned about is making sure we protect labour standards in our own country as well as internationally. And governments can play a really important role in making that happen.
Well, the Number 10 spokesperson has said the comments by Gary Neville were neither legitimate nor appropriate. Laura, I want to show you this because the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, has been visiting a hospital today. He was confronted by a mother whose daughter has cystic fibrosis. Let's take a look.
We have a daughter with a life-limiting, a life-shortening condition, and we have some brilliant experts, and they're being worked to the bone, and actually the level of care they provide is amazing, but they're not being able to provide it in the way they want to provide it because the resourcing is not there, Like I said, on Monday we were due to be in, and the number of people coming through the door is too many, and it's not fair to blame it on the pandemic anymore, is it? Because actually, we have problems in the NHS.
Right to your face, you Tory cunt. Stop blaming it on the damn pandemic.
Before we went into the pandemic, we were short of doctors, we were short of beds going into the pandemic. So I think
that doesn't mean to say the pandemic didn't have an effect. However, as this woman is just pointing out, and as I've pointed out so many times, our NHS was falling over before the pandemic happened. Pandemic just helped to nudge it a bit further. Fuck's sake.
It's really wrong to blame it on the pandemic, and actually the damage that you're doing to families like myself is...
Tree of life, love. Tree of life.
What do you think of that, Laura? Do you think she's right? You can't blame all this on the pandemic.
Well, look, that's a very...
well, look, shut up.
Emotive conversation by a mother who's dealing with the NHS in a very direct...
Oh, you unsensitive cunt. Oh, you unsensitive cunt. Oh, it's just a sensitive, it's just distraught mother. And she's like, fuck off. No, this woman is seeing the truth of the matter. You refuse to.
Right way because of her child.
She won't be the only one, of course.
No, of course not. So, I mean, do I...
She doesn't have a clue what to say. Fuck's sake.
Accept there's a huge amount of pressure on the NHS, which I think was the kernel of her complaint. Yes, I do accept that. And I don't think that's...
No. The whole thing. Don't just pick apart the whole thing.
Suggested that it was all...
No, but I think the government, she's implying that the government has, and the idea that this has all come about as a result of the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, is not true, she says.
No, I accept that, and I think there have been structural issues with the NHS for decades, actually.
And the Tories have been in government since 2010.
But I think they predate that, and I don't think they're actually the responsible...
I'm sorry, but whilst there were failings, the NHS was never anywhere near this point under Labour. It just wasn't. None of the statistics show that.
Of any particular political party in government. What I do think, though, is that the pandemic and things like the effect of inflation haven't helped with some of the...
Could Labour have done more? Of course they could have. But did they do this? Did they treat the NHS with the same with the level of neglect that the Tories have? No. Not a chance.
The issues that she's describing.
Ärra? Well, when Labour left power in 2010, the NHS had the highest public satisfaction level ever recorded.
Boom.
And since then, what we've seen is mismanagement and an underinvestment.
Tree of life. Yeah? The tree is is something as a symbol I also think should be added. Because the healthcare is at the root and stem of it that helps all this to branch off. The NHS, the education system. The NHS, education, and the welfare system. They're properly backed up. People won't have to need to use the welfare system as much. They won't need to.
Went into the pandemic with the government cutting support to the NHS,
and that was during the crash, the financial crash.
Now we have 7 million people on waiting lists. We've seen the NHS brought to its knees, and the government is not actually dealing with the substantive issues facing the NHS. They, as we said earlier, they were clapping NHS workers during the pandemic, and now what we have is a neglect, and that needs to be resolved. Charlotte?
I think there's several things going on here, really, which is why it's so intractable. I certainly had a conversation with one of my colleagues at the Sunday Times, our health editor, the other day, where I was essentially saying, can the NHS continue to exist in its current form? Because you do have an ageing population. I was essentially saying, look, when I get old and leave the NHS, is it still going to be there? And he said that actually it wasn't necessarily just a structural problem, that if funding had kept up with other European countries, we would be in a significantly different position when it came to the amount of money in the system. But it's not just money as well, because of course you do have an incredibly slow pace of change in parts of the NHS. It is very difficult to move such a huge organisation quickly, and so there are two different things going on there, which then combine, of course, because if you just said, right, tomorrow, massive cash injection, there are all these different parts which aren't working as effectively as they could be, and therefore just suddenly throwing a bunch of money at it wouldn't put it back to the place it could have been had there been long-term reform and cash injections over a series of decades.
Your observations of the NHS, if you've had any personal experience recently?
Yeah, I had a baby 2 months ago, and the women who looked after me were beyond knackered. The care that I got wasn't great, and it was very clear that there was, that it wasn't working as it should do. And actually, that's been the experience of maternity wards all over the country. And we've had some, discussion about the terrible scandals that are happening in that particular area of healthcare. But I mean, we're not. These strikers are not trying to start a conversation about the status of the NHS and all that kind of thing. They are arguing for their individual and collective right to have, enact industrial action and get better wages. I mean, it really is quite tiresome listening to all this gas and air from politicians about, well, when we had the NHS, it was great, but now it's your fault, Why don't you actually, face the question, which is, are you going to meet this pay demand? Neither of your parties are. Neither of your parties want to meet the 19% pay raise. And for an individual nurse, that's all that matters. I don't want to hear about your apologies for, doing the clapping. Don't want to hear about whose fault it is. Just want to hear that you're going to do something.
But what else? I'm sorry, but what else are Labour supposed to fucking say? Look, yeah, right. This is the 19. But the point is, the nurses have said they would negotiate. Labour are saying they would negotiate. What else are they supposed to say, woman? It's all well and good. Oh, they don't want to hear. Oh, but it was. The NHS was funded properly under Labour. And trying to say, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? How can Labour do anything about it now when they are not in power? And the Tories refuse to call a general election. We need an old thing for that to happen. There's no point with this constant, oh, they don't want to hear that, they don't want to hear this, they don't want to hear that, when all that the Labour MP was doing was speaking fucking truths. Because that's all she's able to do at the moment, because the Tories refuse to call an election. Now, yes, you do have a point about pay. However, nurses have said they negotiate, Labour are saying they negotiate, Tories refuse to. Big difference. It's not about playing politics here. Labour are saying they would actually negotiate. Under Labour, these strikes likely wouldn't have happened. Especially with the nurses. But no, you just we're going to attack both sides. Despite the fact the Tories are the only ones that can do anything right now. But again, it's just absolutist thinking.
Thing. And at the end of the day, you know, negotiations are just, I think for a lot of people, we understand now that negotiations are a byword for government saying just kick it into the long grass, keep stalling.
I'm sorry. Oh. The nurses themselves have said, come to negotiate. If it was just a stall tactic, then why are the nurses asking for it? They aren't just look, yes, they have asked for a 19-point-odd%, right? They have also asked for the government to come to the table to negotiate pay. How is that a stall tactic then, you tard? See, again, this just proves my point. She'll come out with some good points, and then she'll say something stupid.
Stalling, keep stalling. And for a worker, that doesn't, you know, that doesn't cut it. So, you know.
It's not stalling when they themselves, the workers, the unions representing the workers, are saying come to negotiate. Labour are saying, yeah, we would. That's not fucking, you know, shoving it under the carpet for later, you stupid twat.
Meet their demands or not.
That, to me, is cynicism for the sake of cynicism. What's the point of it?
These are politicians here. Do you accept that? Should those demands be met?
I don't think they should be met, because I heard the head of the Royal College of Nursing herself on Newsnight about a week ago stepping back quite significantly from the 19% and taking umbrage.
But she said she would negotiate. This hard line crap doesn't work.
Which actually, even the suggestion that was still the request.
The only thing it does work to do is piss people off further. That's what the Tories want. I would like to know why.
That she was much more flexible than that. So I don't, and I also think you do have to consider the taxpayer, because the truth is, we pay.
They are also paying taxes. What the fuck? Right. Does this woman kind of get that NHS workers also pay taxes into the NHS? What the fuck? Damn Tories!
Public sector workers, and so when you consider whether a 20% pay rise, which is effectively how it has been presented, is appropriate, you have to think about the impact on other taxpayers and on their disposable income, and that's the point of a pay review body, that it balances.
But the money could still be found from elsewhere. You can't be you're just saying, you're coming out with a number saying this will cost this much, right? With no effort of saying, oh, but we wouldn't be able to find it. Yeah, you could. You just can't be bothered.
It's everything. The tax take.
Well, you don't fucking want to. Because it's profit. And to Tories, profit is king, not Charlie.
budget to the NHS, the overall remuneration that's given to other members of staff of the NHS, and also supporting private sectors. None of this is easy, but it can be quite easy to say, well, you should give nurses what they want, and that is actually would be an irresponsible.
Well, let me get Roshanara to respond to your demand in that sense, which is meet the pay demands and stop talking about it was better in my day.
We're not in power. The question was asked.
Yeah,
about
that is the one response you need to the stupid question from Emma Wheeler. Get around the table. Labour aren't in power. How are they supposed to get around the table, dickhead? Convince the Tory to call a general election. Then they can get into power. Then they can get round the table. But you can't demand shit from Labour when they aren't in power. Don't be stupid.
the state of the NHS. That's what I was responding to. And what we had is the current government, chopping and changing the Lansley reform, a lot of
the top-down reforms under Cameron,
which cause disruption. And also we've got a lack of training, investment in training of nurses and doctors. So these are systemic issues that do need to be addressed.
Yeah, it's always like, but this, but that, but that. Oh, so we might have to move to a different system. No, if you'd actually kept the nurses' bursary, kept incentives up for people to go into nursing, this is another aspect that could have curbed the problem we are currently having.
The point about negotiation is it's not about kicking the can. It is about making sure that the negotiations between the government of the day and the workers actually happen. If we don't, we're going to end up stuck in this gridlock, and that needs to be unlocked by the government of the day.
All right.
So this is not academic. It's not an academic point. It's a serious point.
Let's have a look at this breaking news, which has come out in the last hour or so. We've been expecting it, and that is a High Court decision on the government's Rwanda policy. Let's have a look at the tweets from my colleague Dominic Casciani, the BBC Home Affairs correspondent. High Court rules that the British government's plan to send some asylum seekers from the UK to Rwanda to have their claims considered there is lawful and doesn't breach the Refugee Convention or human rights laws. The court, however, rules that each of the 8 individual migrants in this case who had arrived by small boats were treated unlawfully. The Home Secretary's officials must reconsider their cases, but the fundamental point is the Rwanda scheme is lawful. Is that something to celebrate, Laura?
No.
Well, the Rwanda scheme is a product of the fact that we have got a problem with small boat arrivals.
And your government doesn't know what to fucking do with it, so it comes up with gimmicks.
And it's not about whether it's something to celebrate. It's about, well, first of all, the principle of removal of asylum seekers to a safe third country was a Labour policy. It's in the 2004 Asylum Act. Schedule 3 of that sets out the principle. And the issue for the court was whether Rwanda was capable of amounting to a safe country. Yeah. Whether there was a risk that if people were sent there, they would be persecuted again, whether their asylum claims would be safely processed, whether they would be kept safe, whether they would have opportunities, or whether they would be sent back to unsafe places. All of those questions were litigated in the High Court, and on all of them, the government has been found to have acted lawfully. In fact, Rwanda is a signatory to the Refugee Convention, so it's bound by those obligations anyway, but that wasn't the limits of the decision. So I think just as a point of principle on Human Rights Act, on the interpretation of the 1951 Convention, I think it was the right decision, and I also think it was a foreseeable decision, because when the case was litigated through that all the way to the Supreme Court, actually in the summer, at the interim stage, you'll recall there was an injunction of the sort. The government won on that as well. Right. So it is consistent with that judgment.
You must be disappointed by the decision, because Labour have said that that's one piece of the policy to deal with small boat crossings that they can't support, and they would definitely drop it. Do you want to change your mind about it because it's now been deemed lawful?
It's completely disappointing, absolutely. But the court has made its ruling, but it is unethical and it's costly and it's unworkable. And
I like that. Unethical. Whilst it can no longer be called unlawful, it doesn't mean it's not unethical. Laws can still be unethical.
What we need to do is make sure that the Home Office backlog is addressed for those.
For example, until a certain point in the last century, it was legal to prosecute gay people for being gay. That's completely unethical, but it was law.
who are applying now. There are thousands of people waiting for a very long time.
Well, Rishi Sunak has said there are going to be more people employed.
They've been in power for 12 years. They haven't got a grip on the asylum system. The second thing is there are millions of people who are refugees in other parts of the world. And I do a lot of work on those issues. So what does that say to other countries? That they should start deporting people? You know, Bangladesh hosts 1 million, Jordan hosts a million, well over 1 million, and Lebanon, all those countries are hosting refugees. So should they be deporting people on planes to other countries? That causes chaos. We need to get a grip on our system.
Not only that, but we're supposed to be cutting down on plane use. So this also does not conform to the government's green agenda. Don't get me wrong. Like, it's not like they're going to be taking many people to Rwanda. They can't. It's in the contract. And not only that, but the planes are still coming back the other way with passengers. So it's not even like we're getting rid of. I hate to use the vulgar language, but it's not like we're getting rid of them, and we got more space. No, we're swapping. It's a fucking refugee swap, asylum seeker swap. This is essentially what it is. This is why the plan is stupid.
The NCA needs to be properly funded to deal with organised criminal gangs. The government is not getting a grip on those issues. This is, again, another distraction. It's not going to deal with the substance of the problem, and that's what people want, the government to get a grip on the asylum system.
How significant a decision is this for the government?
I think the fact that the government has won on the general policy will be taken very seriously in Downing Street. It's something that is a positive for them in getting this through. But I think the fact that you do have the court also saying, right, all of the 8 people who are involved in this were not treated lawfully does give us a sense of the fact that this is very much not over for the government. These specific cases are incredibly complex. They are incredibly legally complex, and every single time the government tries to put someone on a flight, they will go through this same litigation process, and every single time they will face this challenge, and it will be expensive, it will take a long time, and in most cases, by the looks of it, if we look at the data we've got today, they are going to lose. So this is not the end for the government at all, but nonetheless, a minor victory on their front, I would say.
Oh, right, you think it's a minor victory, and Ærra has said it's unethical and unworkable, even if it's deemed lawful, or certainly the principle of it. But the heart of this is that it was supposed to be a deterrent. And that is why the government wanted to see this through. And Suella Braverman has said that it was her ambition, her dream, I think, to see a flight go to Rwanda with asylum seekers to have their claims actually processed there. So far, no one's gone. Could it be a deterrent?
Well, we know that deterrents of this kind just don't work. I mean,
once again, she says something clever. Please don't screw it up. And it's not me being sexist either. I'd say the same thing if she was a bloke. And people jumping down my throat, oh, it's just because she's a woman. I'm not sexist.
The proof is in the pudding. It doesn't work. People still arrive in increasingly dangerous means. And, you cannot be a politician.
Says here, the government's plan to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda is lawful, rules High Court.
Particularly in this government, crying about the fact that crocodile tears, I might add, most of the time it seems like, about deaths in the sea, at the same time as using, phrases like hostile environment. I mean, Kenan Malik in his Observer column over the weekend described this as the immigration and asylum system as a theatre of cruelty. At one level, this is pretty much about trying to send messages to a voting public about the fact that we're getting serious on immigration, and it's not just unworkable. I would, make the distinction between things being legal and things being illegal and things being politically unsound. Because I'm glad that the court has made this decision, because I think it's a problem for, democratically, that a government can't make policy and can't enact that policy and being hamstrung by lawyers left, right and centre. That, that's an issue in the abstract.
Okay.
But part of this, that we have to talk more holistically, not just about the specifics of deportation or the asylum system, but also about what we think about immigration in this country. There's this kind of sort of facetious idea that because people voted Brexit or, you know, whatever, that we're all sort of champing on the bit to put people on deportation flights. Actually, it's much more complex than that, and we haven't had an open discussion about immigration.
Briefly, Charlotte, because we've got a guest to go to.
I would slightly say being hamstrung by lawyers probably isn't what happens, because the government makes the laws and then the lawyers enforce them. If they aren't happy with the laws being enforced, they should change the laws, and they have the capacity to do that.
Alt Mehmet from the pressure group Migration Watch joins us now. Your response to the High Court's decision, the ruling?
I welcome it. I think it's a step in the right direction. It remains to be seen now what the government will do and whether or not the process that has been stalled with removals to Rwanda will be restarted.
It just... Like, you've got a Migration Watch. I bet that sounds so innocent, doesn't it?
I hope it...
Okay, double standards there, CJ. Okay, I might be applying double standards here. You know, I might be just being cynical for the sake of being cynical. I'm not trying to be, but I just can't help it. This, like, oh, this kind of thing, Migration Watch, do we need it? Like, under the government's rules, most of these people who are coming up with this stuff, who are also not of Germanic origin, northwestern Germanic origin, are also saying, "Oh, this is a great idea," but they wouldn't have been able to get in. Their families wouldn't have been able to get in under the same rules. So they wouldn't have been here to say this if these rules had been in place when they were coming over. So how is it good? There is an argument to that, a somewhat legitimate argument to that, of it's not the same time. Double standards again. You know, we can't have a go at, you can't be having a go at old people for being racist, saying it's you know, it's not 60 years ago anymore. There is that, I suppose. But is the meaning there still applicable? Is how I would still respond.
It does. If it does, I think it will help. It will actually help to send the right message that if you get here illegally across the channel,
you're not going to be... At most, they're thinking it's 200 people. But we're getting other people, but it's a swap. Why is no one saying that? It's a swap. It's not like we're, you know, say, but this is going to be a swap.
Won't be able to stay.
Roshanara?
We had a Conservative MP on a select committee point out that the legal routes for those seeking refuge in our country have almost all but diminished. So I think what the government does need to do is do the work that needs to be done to prevent those who are exploiting desperate people seeking refuge, to stop the problem at source, and also make sure there is a proper pathway for people to be able to...
You get the government going, oh, but there are pathways. No, you set up specific pathways for specific people. The people coming along these routes aren't people that can go on those pathways, because otherwise they'd be going on those fucking pathways.
Apply for refugee status through a legal mechanism, particularly women and children. They are the most exploited and vulnerable, and we just don't have a system that's working, and that's what needs to be addressed.
Mehmet, would you want to respond? That was Roshanara Ali, the Labour MP.
Well, most of those coming across the channel are actually male. They are young, working age males, so it's not.
We have employment problems in this country.
the case that everyone is actually a refugee. And when people talk about this,
just because you're male and young doesn't mean you're not a refugee. It seems to be lost on a lot of people, right? Young people will also leave a war-torn country because they don't want to be drafted into an army. Is this beyond the imagination of people for some fucking reason?
That's why the traffickers, with respect, the traffickers need to be
and legal
tackled.
routes. Having safe and legal routes, do they really understand what that means? Whether you're going to set up application points around Europe, around France, and if people are going to be able to go to these application points and submit.
That's why you specifically set up these places in, say, Calais and other places along the damn coast.
An application that they'll be overrun within days.
This is why you set several big buildings up, right? You have them staffed. This is why you have it jointly planned with the French. This is not impossible. But it's a much better workable plan, and it's much more ethical than shipping people off to Rwanda and receiving people from Rwanda in return. What's the point in that plan?
Frankly, and what happens at the point where they're either refused or indeed their applications are...
Right. Again, this guy's being all absolutist here. He's trying to find holes, right? This is thought about, well, if people think, if a minister in charge or whatnot thinks about this properly, then you have these redundancies in place. If the processing doesn't work, then you have someone, then you have a separate place so they can be diverted to be taken back. You set these things up. Is it easy? No. But expecting it to be like, thinking it's good, wanting something easy or sounds easy, and it being the better option, that doesn't usually marry. I'm sorry, but in my experience, the hard option is usually the better option, because that way you learn. Like, you actually learn.
Are denied. It just doesn't make sense, frankly.
What do you mean it doesn't make sense? Again, I just pointed a hole in the hole that you tried to point, prick.
This decision today to remove people to Rwanda, where they're going to be helped.
We're receiving migrants in return, you dickhead. This guy doesn't have a clue. Again, Migrant Watch. I wonder what kind of group these people are.
To set up new lives, I think is the right one, and is to be welcomed.
Ærra? Well, I was simply, one thing I would say is that it's really important that we have the partnership with the French government. We make sure that there are appropriate negotiations to prevent people being exploited getting on those boats, because people are dying en route. We saw that
last week, 4 people dead.
And the point is that we've seen with the Ukraine crisis, the government has introduced some mechanisms for appropriate, safe ways for those who...
Hong Kong.
And it being them being Tories, their systems weren't efficient enough, right? Because they don't like this kind of thing. But with a government with a different ethos, a different way of thinking, we might have more efficient procedures like we used to have before the Tories shut them all down.
Ukraine, Afghanistan.
And before Brexit, we could actually send people back. It was called the Dublin Agreement. Do you know what Boris Johnson did not bother to do when we left the EU? To set up something similar. So if you want to blame someone for this so-called migrant crisis, blame Boris.
There are ways in which they can do the right things, and there are lessons to be learnt, and they're choosing not to. So if there is the political will to sort this out, they can, and actually they're not dealing with the fundamentals here, and the trafficking issue cannot be addressed without supporting the NCA, without negotiations with the French to set up a system.
Let me bring in the others.
Prevent people being exploited like that.
Hang on a second, and I'll come back to you, Ella. And I'll come to
Alva's right in pointing out the fact that those of us who want to have a more liberal immigration system, of which I am one, have to stop kind of pretending that the only people coming over in small boats are extremely vulnerable women fleeing some kind of persecution.
Right, but this is driving me mad. Apparently, if you're male, you can't be a refugee. I hate to say this in an absolutist way. That's how they're putting it across. And the reality is, it's nowhere near that absolute. They're treating it as if the only people who are refugees are the women and children. I'm sorry, but young men don't want to fight in a war. No!
But the solution, doesn't have to be how do you crack down harder. You could actually take a look at, politicians in this country are constantly going on about labour shortages and the need to, fill positions left, right, and centre. And our points-based system, begun under Labour government and expanded under the Conservatives, is incredibly stringent. It's prevents the working class of Europe from entering this country. You have to have a PhD, you have to high-paid job, you have to be of the kind of European bourgeoisie to be able to get in here. Why not take a chance? Suggest that these young men who are willing to come and try and make a better life for themselves come through safe and legal means, become citizens, and contribute to the society in the same way.
Well, then why don't we set up safe and legal routes? She completely sidestepped that argument. So, if we were doing a liberal, but we got to make sure that we just sidestepped the fact that we need the safe and legal routes in the first place. So, again, at the beginning of this subject, she said something. She said something clever, and she ends it by saying something stupid. What are we in the WWE?
Get you to respond, Laura, but Alf, you were laughing then or scoffing. I don't quite know which.
Well, the points-based system has had some sort of constraining effect. It hasn't. It's done the opposite, frankly. But going back to working with the French, yes, if only the French were prepared to take people back in the way that
they have stopped about
we
40%.
would like them to.
They have stopped about 40% of the crossings.
No, the other thing is, with regard, sorry to interrupt you, but with regard to the French, they allow 20% of asylum applications. 20%. We allow at first instance 75%. The EU generally accepts only 39%.
Oh, right. One of the reasons behind this so-called abnormality you've pointed out there, mate, is because the EU is already full. We barely take anyone compared to Europe. That's why the numbers are different. Stupidity of people. Again, Migration Watch. What kind of people are these people?
And so roughly half the rates that we accept. It's simply wrong that we're not.
But they are taking 5 times more than us. They can't just accept everyone that they take. They're already overrun with people migrating from the Middle East and Africa. And then with the additional lot from Ukraine. Britain treats it as if we are under this huge pressure from migration. We aren't! We need it!
Doing our bit, and frankly, 1.1 million people coming here long term with a net migration of over 500,000 is absolutely absurd, and why it has to be controlled. Immigration has to be reduced.
Do you agree with that, Laura? I mean, I'll just show people the headline, perhaps referencing some of the figures Out was quoting there, the Daily Mail. 1 million migrants a year will soon be the norm after figures showed a rise of 430.
Right, I'm sorry. We've just passed 8 billion people on this planet. 8 billion! There has never been this many people on the planet at the same time. Not that we know of. And this guy seems to think that we can go back to the same fucking numbers we used to. It's stupid. The levels of migration are going to go up because of climate change for a start. Another one is going to be there are going to be more wars. People are going to move. This attitude of we can't take any more is unrealistic. It's stupid and it's completely unethical.
5,000 year on year, according to a think tank. Of the 1.1 million entry clearance grants in the year to June 22, different to net migration, because of course that takes in the numbers of people leaving.
I don't know what the empirical basis is for that, so I'm not going to comment on it. But what I will say, with the small boats, they provoke a specific and distinct problem. In 2020, just 2 years ago, 8,000 people made the crossing by small boat. We're now on track for 45,000 people to
and that's since the policy was announced in April, so it hasn't acted as a deterrent, has it?
But the policy hasn't been enacted. No flight has taken off. And if I just...
But the thing is the threat of it was supposed to be the deterrent. Those were the exact words said. The threat of it should be the deterrent. It doesn't fucking work!
Just can make a couple of points. Of those 45,000, 13,000 are Albanian and 11,500 of them are young men. So
again, this thing about young men. As if young men aren't refugees either. As well. What? No. All these people have got to be terrorists. Fucking racists.
Possibility, as Ella says, actually, that not every single person is a refugee, or that there should be the possibility.
Under that same banner, you could say the same thing about women. But no, you're not going to.
Of returns to safe countries. There's been a deal announced with Albania, and the High Court today has said that in accordance with human rights principles and the Refugee Convention, Rwanda is also a safe country. And the point of Rwanda...
cut the funding of the NCA. These agencies can actually help to prevent people being exploited, people being put on boats that are
National
dangerous
Crime
and risky
Agency,
and dying while trying to...
And the government cut funding for it.
Why are they doing these things? Because if they're serious about tackling this problem at source, then they would do that. And also, since we left the EU, it means that we don't have the arrangements that we had with the French. The Dublin Agreement does need to...
It was never very successful.
But we do need a new arrangement.
Let Laura respond, Rishanara, to those comments about Dublin.
So I've done a number of cases in the immigration tribunals on Dublin 3. It was very difficult to remove, and overall we ended up having more people than removing them. It didn't really work for various human rights rights-related reasons.
Calling the French president a foe by Liz Truss isn't exactly particularly helpful in damaging relations with the French.
I take that point, but I think there has been a new constructive relationship.
Right. But again, we could have worked to change the rules or to adapt the rules if we'd stayed in EU.
Between the Prime Minister and the French President.
But again, nothing even like the Dublin Agreement was bothered to be set up. And as the Labour MP put across then, it doesn't help when our government treats the French like they're once again the enemy, like we're back in the 100 Years' War again. Fuck's sake. The Tories missed the days of empire. And they can't accept that those days are gone. They are gone. Accept it.
I think you've seen that in the last few weeks. The Prime Minister did talk about funding for the NCA in his announcement last week, and also safe and legal routes.
That was years after being in government, with respect.
But you say there's no safe.
12 years.
You say there's no safe and legal routes, but since March of this year, we've taken 150,000 Ukrainians.
That was a Conservative.
Again, Ukrainians on a safe and legal route that you'd specifically set up for the Ukrainians. They keep resorting to this. And the argument is a complete fallacy.
People, his words, not mine.
We've taken 100. Well, don't talk over each other. Go on.
Right, well, I don't want to. I don't want to have a disagreement. But we have. I mean, just one scheme. The Homes.
I'm sorry, that's complete bullshit. I'm sorry. A Tory doesn't want to have a disagreement with Labour. Bollocks.
Scheme, 150,000 people now living safely in the United Kingdom. As I say, I take your point on safe and legal
as an example of where good work can be done.
Mehmet, thank you very much for joining us today on that decision from the High Court. Now, you may remember a film that we showed a few years ago. Just a warning, some of the language you may find offensive. Let's take a look.
I was walking down a really busy street with my headphones in when a guy told me that I was sexy and had a great ass. When I ignored him, he started saying really aggressive things, calling me
Your big chest makes men want to come at you. Don't push away cute guys.
A guy told me that if I kept eating, I would no longer be pretty and that no guy would ever want me.
The Our Streets Now campaign is run by sisters 21-year-old Maya and 15-year-old Gemma. They want to make street harassment illegal and are collecting stories of other women's experiences. It also...
Right. I want you to have a word on this subject because I've had people who are from a couple of decades older than me try to tell me, oh, but it was a compliment in my day. It's not a compliment anymore. Stop using that as an excuse.
Started when Gemma was walking to meet a friend.
These two men in a white van, very cliche, I know, but they slowed down and basically followed me down the street, making comments about me, about my body, about what I was wearing.
Right. And how are these compliments then? This isn't to the girl talking. These are to the people who are a couple of decades older than me that seem to think, oh, it was alright in my day. It's not alright anymore. How is that complimentary? It isn't.
And it just absolutely terrified me.
So that campaign now has government backing to a private member's bill from the former Business Secretary Greg Clark to make street harassment a criminal offence. Is this legislation a good idea, Laura?
It's a very good idea. First of all, street harassment is already a public order offence, and when I've worked with women in my constituency and in the campaign groups, very often women don't...
I don't usually do this, but I've seen Laura Harris stand up in Parliament, and she talks powerfully about this. This is one area where cross-party agreement, fucking right. I'll stand with her on this one.
Don't know they can report it, and the few that I've met who did report it got quite a patchy response from the police. So this new offence will be located in the public order offences where it already exists, but it will create a distinct offence so that both the police and the public know what they're dealing with.
Yeah, so from what I can gather, this is one area where the Tories actually get something right in legislation. This makes the whole harassment thing a whole lot less unambiguous. It's a whole lot more understandable from what I can gather.
Just one other point.
Yes.
We already have sexual harassment prohibitions in the civil context under the Equality Act. And that already has, because I think one of the things you might be getting at is it reasonable? Is it too low level? Will wolf whistles? You know, it won't, because in the civil sense, there's already, in the statutory language, a sort of barrier that prevents de minimis claims. It imposes a reasonableness test. And I see no reason why that couldn't be applied in the criminal context too.
Seems perfectly credible.
No, it doesn't to me. I think this is a terrible idea, and that's not because I'm an apologist for street harassment or think the kind of words that were labelled at those women in that video are in any way morally right, but because you've already said there's plenty of laws on the statute books to deal with this. This kind of like ridiculous idea that all the police need is another law to kind of get them to get off their backsides and do the job properly is a nonsense. In fact, I think as someone who's
with stalking.
I'm sorry, I've got to argue here. I've got to argue with her here. Ordinarily, I wouldn't, because I'm not one that's usually a fan of adding more law, but again, you've got to think non-absolutist, right? This isn't the be-all and end-all of the, this isn't the be-all end-all solution to the problem of sexual harassment in the street, right? This is just one aspect to try and help with that. You can't treat this as if this is what's the word? As if this is the panacea. It's not. But this is something else that could help.
For example, there was already prohibitions
We
of
know
stalking from the 90s, but they made it a distinct offence in 2012 because police didn't react well enough to the prevention from harassment legislation that sort of dealt.
Because the police found that the wording of the law was too ambiguous
with it. So sometimes a distinct offence really helps.
There's a more important point to this, which is that listening to Greg Clark talk about why he wants to bring in this law, made this really big point about we want to change the culture, and how we change the culture is by instituting law. I completely disagree with that. I think it's a real problem for women's freedom, of which I care about very deeply, that you suggest that we need more intervention from the state, either through legislation or through cops watching us, on the street and looking after us like knights in shining armour. That's a real problem for a sense of women's agency and women's freedom. There's also this ridiculous idea that the men who are shouting sexy legs or whatever worse stuff at women have no concept that it's wrong, don't know that it's illegal, don't know that it's a bad thing. And Greg Clark coming along and saying, now lads, you'll get locked up for doing it is going to stop it. You have to in order to enact social change in favour of...
Right. Again, right. This what she's saying here, all right, I can almost agree with what she's saying. The problem is she's treating it, again, she's treating the legislation as if it's the issue. Now, the Tories might treat it as if it's going to be the panacea, or some Tories might, but I look at this and I see legislation that could help. I agree that relying on legislation to change culture is worrying, very worrying. However, again, it's not so absolute as that. You can use legislation to help. Don't just use it as a blunt tool.
Of women's freedom, it has to be done on an organic social basis, and you're not, simply kind of rubber stamp.
Right, but laws are part of society. They're part of what help to regulate our society. I would like to see the police better funded, better regulated, better trained, better staffed.
Something in Parliament is not going to do anything.
Well, let's pick up on that point about it being or becoming more of a social taboo. That you say, Greg Clark saying, lads, that's enough. Might there be a change with a law like this that makes it harder or makes some people think you shouldn't be doing that?
I think it's entirely plausible, and I do think that there's a very good case to be made that making it very clear that things are illegal, upskirting, good example, does change the attitude around them. All of that being said, I don't know. I find this a very complex one because I was on the tube home the other night and some guy sat down next to me and was harassing me, and it was absolutely awful. So the idea that I could prosecute him, great news, would love it. The problem is, though, we keep getting these new laws of new things on this front that are now illegal. But when you look at the absolute basic things that just should be prosecuted, so rape, for example, only 1.3% of reported rapes even get charged, and that's before you even get into court, and obviously that's usually delayed. And then below that, you have an even lower conviction rate. So we're basically at the point where we've got rape almost legal in this country, and we're worrying about all sorts of other different things when you've got this massive glaring problem at the centre.
I've got to admit, this is a very good point. I can't argue with this point. Not really. Or I would say that this is not a non-issue. It's not as bad an issue, I suppose. Well, not I suppose. It's not as bad an issue as rape, obviously, but I still wouldn't treat it as a non-issue. Again, it's an aspect that could help change the culture of how men treat women in general.
And I almost just want to say, let's put all our energy into that, fixing that problem, and then we can worry about someone shouting at me on the street. Laura?
Yeah, well, you're right. There has been a problem
Don't see
with
why
rape
we can't do
convictions,
both.
and the rape review that the government did last year prompted some major changes in the way that rapes are investigated, the way that they're referred to the CPS, and the charging decisions that follow. And there was some data published last week that regrettably got completely lost that showed that rape prosecutions are up 65% on where they were this time last year. It's not good enough, but it does show that what they're doing is sending it into the right direction. I take your point on rape, and I actually take your point, Anna, too, about culture. And I do know what I think you're both sort of saying. Too much tinkering around the edges doesn't really get women anywhere, and I am actually receptive to that argument. The one thing I would say is that there is a lot of gateway stuff, though, which does lead to more violent offending. Even, for example, just watching violent porn online, which is lawful, but frequent, and can really contribute to deeply misogynistic attitudes that end up being exhibited in a much more serious way elsewhere. So I suppose stuff like that is in the online safety bill, but that's much more targeted at children rather than people overall. And I still think that there are sort of gateway issues that need to be...
I just want to get... Do you support this bill?
We look very closely at what's on the table, and it needs to be carefully defined for the very reasons that have been pointed out, and it's got to be backed by proper resources of the police service to do the prosecutions, to bring the convictions on rape, for instance, on the serious crimes, and on stalking. As somebody who's experienced stalking during my teens as well as a member of parliament, what I can tell you is that without the proper resourcing and mental health support as well, because in some cases with stalking you get a mental health dimension, actually not a great deal happens for a very long time, and vulnerable women can find themselves in extreme danger. So I think the substance needs to be addressed on rape, on stalking, and all the other crimes. And if this particular proposal does change attitude and behaviour, we can look at that, but we need to get the substance right.
Briefly, Ella.
Yeah, well,
crimes.
to make a cheap point first, there's a problem in the police force at the moment with attitudes towards women. So the idea that all these police officers are now going to come along and treat women really well is dubious. And I also
it's someone I was saying earlier. The police themselves need to be policed. This is why deregulation doesn't work. This is why you need regulations. The police themselves need to be regulated. People are like, oh, don't like state intervention, but you're happy for it when you need it, don't you? Fucking
I think it's cynical that a government, a minister is coming along and being the knight in shining armour for women at a time when, polls are looking less than favourable for a government. That aside, I'm not tinkering around the edges with this. I think that it's fundamentally a problem for women that you make more and more aspects of public social interaction illegal. If something might be uncomfortable, something might be unpleasant, it shouldn't be illegal. And I think talking about women's freedom is important here because we don't want protection. Protection and safety is very different from freedom, which is an active, important political principle. And I think we're damaging women's freedom by suggesting that we need all these protective laws to encompass us as we walk down the street.
We're going to talk about...
Right, again, it's not like the laws can't be rescinded in future, but the problem is that the culture needs to change. And unfortunately, young men in this country need a bit of a blunt tool to give them a smack around the face, tell them to stop what the fuck they're doing.
E-scooters coming up to Christmas, they tend to inspire strong reaction. People love them.
I used to have e-scooters. My mum got us e-scooters when we were kids. Pretty decent.
Or load them. BBC reporter Shelley Phelps has covered the experiences of Angharad Paget-Jones, a blind woman who was hit by an e-scooter and who is now frightened and anxious of them. Let's have a look.
I got hit nearly flat on.
If they're found to be using their e-scooters illegally, they could face having their e-scooters seized.
The law needs to catch up to the technology.
Electric scooters have become a familiar sight across the UK. You might have them in your town or city as part of hire trials, or maybe you've seen someone riding a privately owned one on the road illegally.
They're just everywhere. Seems to be no safe space. You can't cross a road without one running a red light. You can't work through the city centre without one just cutting off your path.
Angharad and her guide dog Tudor encounter e-scooters regularly in Cardiff, where she works.
I got hit nearly flat on by one. If my friend hadn't pulled Tudor out the way, he would have been hit, so I took the brunt of it. It was a few bruises and some scrapes, so I got off quite lucky because obviously we had been pulled out the way, so only like half of me got hit. But yeah, if my dog got hit, that was the scariest part.
The incident has had a lasting effect.
You should question every step, or you should just be able to work through and it's fine. And Tudor himself now, like hears one or sees one coming and he'll stop.
If you buy an e-scooter, you can only use it on private land with the landowner's permission. Some police forces are urging people to think twice before gifting one for Christmas, as the recipient could end up on the wrong side of the law.
If they're found to be using their e-scooters illegally, they could face having their e-scooters seized and they're unlikely to get them back. They could end up going to court for driving otherwise in accordance with a licence and using a vehicle with no insurance. And the sort of penalties they could face for that would be a fine, penalty points on their licence, or a driving disqualification.
Riders and manufacturers want to see private e-scooters legalised on roads.
So it's just that the law needs to catch up to the technology. I mean, they're cheap, they're economical, and they're environmentally friendly, to operate. And with the expansion of low emission zones cropping up all over the country, from London to Birmingham, Liverpool, and all these different places, they're an automatic answer to helping reduce vehicle traffic and therefore reducing carbon emissions.
I'm very surprised. BBC video that actually was rather balanced on the arguments on that one, from my own view, that is. I could see both sides of the argument on that, and I'm not sure where I sit, actually. Got to admit.
So, Charlotte, the government says while riding a privately owned e-scooter on public land is currently illegal, it's considering how best to design future regulations. What are your thoughts about them?
I think that anything that gets cars out of city centres when they don't need to be there is obviously a good thing. But as we've just seen in that video there are clearly very serious questions around what can be done when, and making sure that that legislation is done properly is obviously the key thing the government will have to focus on. We'll say, I think the electric bikes, the ones that help you pedal, those seem to be the thing that most people I know actually like using. And I wonder if we focus too much on e-scooters because they're new and exciting, whereas actually we had it there all along in terms of what we should be using.
I mean, I think there's a limiter on speed. It might be going beyond my technical expertise here to be able to differentiate. But what's your view about e-scooters at all, and whether it can be enforced in terms of getting them off the road if they're illegal?
There are these pilots, so we need to make sure that lessons are learnt from that and there's a proper legislative framework for them. But I worry about them as it is at the moment, because you see it when you're walking down the street on pavements. You'll see e-scooters, and if there are families, children, mums with buggies or elderly people, you notice how disruptive that is, and it can be very dangerous. So we need to make sure the government speeds up the process of making sure there's a proper framework for safety. Otherwise, frankly, they're a huge problem and a huge distraction.
That's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back with the...
Yeah, on that last subject, I don't know where I sit on that. I used to have e-scooters. I've ridden bikes when I used before my back went. I don't know. I can see. I mean, I accidentally, well, a few years ago, before my back started giving me problems, I used to ride everywhere on my mountain bike. Now, I can't see this side, but I hear very well, and I'm always, if I've got to look that side, if I feel I've got to look, but some kid just ran out. I didn't see it coming. I didn't ride off. I was there in the middle of Torquay High Street, and I did not know where to put my face. I wasn't. As far as I was aware, I wasn't. I was on the legal part. In the middle where cars tend to go, but this kid just out of nowhere. It haunts me now. And so I mean, I'm not entirely sure what the legislation is on bicycles, but I wasn't on a path. I was on a road, technically, in the middle of High Street. I don't know. I think this subject is a bit difficult. I don't know where I sit on it. I think if more comes up about this, I might do a bit more research, actually get a definitive viewpoint on it. But yeah, well, that was rather explosive. Wow. Like the subject, I think it was more the subject matter rather than the people this week, because there are people that come on here that just drive me mad. But I think this week, yeah, it was more the subject matter, and the migrant watch dude. Fucking, oh, yeah. So yeah, I just, when it comes to migrants, we need to stop treating we seem to think that male migrants are like they're not refugees because they're male migrants. Like the language around it says to me that we're treating males as if they're not refugees. If you're a male, you're not refugee. Well, how does that make sense? Oh, no, they're just looking for work. Right. And why is that a problem? No, they're not refugees. They're just coming in. They're economic migrants. Well, given that most of the time these men are coming from the same countries that the women are coming from, the argument falls fucking flat. Young men don't want to go to war. Not unless they're, being brought up to believe it's the right thing to do. But even then, oftentimes, young kids do not want to go to fucking war. They don't want to be drafted into some army to fight in a war that they don't want to fucking fight. So yeah, they're going to want to move. They're going to want to find work in another country. But the attitude is, to me, utterly sickening and completely unethical. But anyway, I'm going to end it here. We're going a bit further on than I wanted to. It's been quite a riled up one. Like I said, as soon as I get the software so I can record video as well, I'll see what I can do. But yeah, this has been Shadow Wita on my reaction to Politics Live from what date did I say it was? From the 26th of Ærra. That's the 19th. And I would ask you once again, please like, comment, drop some comments down, tell me what you think, and please subscribe. Join the Shadow Wotan. And like I've done on at the end of the last couple of videos, might put a poll up to see what people think. I don't know. But I'm thinking of doing some sort of book story related stuff. Sort of Pratchett, Horowitz, Tolkien, Derek Landy, that sort of Christopher Paolini, that sort of stuff. It's my favourite authors, and delve into my favourite characters and my favourite books and stuff. So tell me what you guys think. And have a good day, people. Blessed be. Stay safe, people.